Okay, thank you. This will be a fairly short presentation, reviewing things that the council looked at back in January and February. Bill was on vacation this week, out of the office. Mike was, you could see, was sitting around in the back of the council chambers waiting to see if I needed any help with this. I decided to operate without a net, so we'll see if I can soldier through this. This has to do with this area of town. This is now what is the South Couplet. This is what it looked like. I believe Bill said this was 1963 or 1958, something like that. Changed quite a bit. This is Sweet Avenue here. This is 95 running right up Main Street. This is Highway 8. This is the Stubbs Seed Company, and this is a concrete batch plant in here, and is integral to the story that's going to be told here, because it's looking at the capacity of Paradise Creek as it runs through this area. And if you look at these bridges here and this bridge here, those act as obstructions to the floodway of the creek, which in high water backs the water up and causes flooding. And that's integral to what we'll be discussing very quickly here. This is the modern area that we're talking about. Concrete batch plants are gone, of course. They were over in this area. This is, again, still the old Stubbs Seed building. Now, of course, Identity on Main is filling this in, but this is the floodway of Paradise Creek winding in and out here. So those bridges you saw were in this area right here and this area right here. They were concrete bridges, and they weren't built to the same capacity as these bridges that you see now. They were built to a much smaller capacity. So, as you recall, back in January and February of 2018, the Urban Renewal Agency was approached by a developer, and all of this property is within the Legacy Crossing Urban Renewal District, was approached by this developer because they wanted to develop some lots in this area right in here. And this, of course, is Highway 8, South Couplet, and this is the area that we just showed in that previous map. Now, what's the issue here is that if you take this green line here and follow it up around here and down around there, all of these light green lots are within the 100-year floodplain. What that means is that properties that are developed need to be developed and raised 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain to meet our building code. A good example of this is if you look down on University Point across from Gambino's on 6th Street, you'll notice that that building is about 2 feet higher than the surrounding streetscape. That is because it was constructed prior to a remapping of the 6th Street floodplain, which was done later by the University of Idaho and the city of Moscow, which, in fact, because of the improvements that have been done to Paradise Creek, lowered actually the 100-year floodplain. Had that building been constructed after those improvements had been made, then it would have been at street level. But that is why developers are so concerned about coming in and developing these properties unless they're very sure of where the 100-year floodplain is. So at any rate, an assessment was done by the Urban Renewal Agency, a very quick and dirty assessment late last year, to try and determine whether it was feasible and what the hopefully results would be if the floodplain were remapped. So if you look here, this is that floodplain, 100-year floodplain area that I just talked about. And the concrete batch plant bridges were over here, but as you can see, there is quite a bit of space there between the southern, dang it, excuse me, sorry, wrong finger, from the southern boundary of the 100-year floodplain to the northern boundary again. So you can see a lot of this area, a lot of buildings and building lots would be affected by this floodplain. So that's why this developer was asking the URA if they were interested in reviewing it. So the URA initially contacted Alta Engineering, the former Terra Graphics firm, to go ahead and do a very preliminary assessment. They did that. You recall that back in January, they were here, the Urban Renewal Agency Executive Director, who also happens to be Bill Belknap, came in and asked the council if they were interested in participating in phase 2 of that assessment, which was Alta Engineering was retained to do that as well, and the URA board reviewed that. URA was the one that actually contracted with Alta Engineering, and the estimated cost of that project was $16,000. So the URA board authorized or directed the executive director to come to council and request the city to participate to one half of that $16,000. Brandy's here. She was here throughout all that whole discussion.
The reasoning for that was that approximately half of the properties within those light green properties were outside of the URA district, but still within the city. That was the reasoning for coming to asking for the city.
And I do need to make the statement that both the URA and the city mapping this floodplain helps local development. It helps the citizens. There is no mandate that the city or the URA is under any obligation to map the floodplain. In fact, we had a floodplain remap suggested on the other side, the east side of Mountain View, several years ago, and at that time the Army Corps of Engineers indicated that individual property owners were free to do a reassessment if they wanted to. So at any rate, it's a good thing that the URA is involved in this, and also the city being asked to participate. So on January 18th and February 5th, City Council agreed to fund one half of that phase 2 work. The phase 2 work is a lot more in-depth. It's where the actual capacity assessments are made, measurements are taken, because a lot of the data points that were establishing the initial floodplain were in question because they were made quite a long time ago, and a lot of changes. In fact, you know, those bridges are gone, perhaps the channel has been widened in places, other obstructions, so on and so forth. So Alta completed the phase 2 field survey and the modeling analysis, and the study indicates that after the bridge structures, those concrete bridge structures I talked about, were taken out, the 1% probability event area, which is a technical way of saying the 100-year floodplain. So out of all your events in 100 years, there's a 1% chance that you'll get water that will come up to a certain level, and that's your 100-year floodplain, was significantly reduced so that 23 of the 29 impacted properties would be outside the 100-year floodplain. So if you go through, and we've got a few more slides here, you can see kind of the overview of the areas now. This blue line is actual Paradise Creek. The green line is the current 100-year floodplain, as you can recall, covering all of this area, and the very light blue line is what the reduced floodplain would be. So a much smaller area that leaves a lot of these properties not affected by that, and thereby not subject to that building regulation that the foundation be, or the ground floor be 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain. So this takes a little bit closer as we look again at the south couplet, and this is the south couplet here. These are the properties in question, but again, you can see the size of that 100-year floodplain, Paradise Creek itself, and then the relative smaller size of the adjusted floodplain. And this was all brought to light by the Alta Phase 2 study. So if you look here, it's a little more graphic with some shaded areas. So a lot of the areas, again, would be not subject to that building regulation. So the next steps that were taken, this was presented to the Urban Renewal Agency by Alta Engineering, that phase 3 of the project, which includes the preparation and submission of the map amendment and application to FEMA, and a cost of about $2,700 to do that. Now, the URA cannot make a direct application to FEMA. That has to be done by the city. So they will be asking the city to sign that letter. And that any additional work necessary would be approximately $1,300 for a total amount of $4,000. It's anticipated that the review time for FEMA would be about 90 days, and there's no application fee, as the amendment is based upon additional, more accurate data, not because of any other particular individual petition. So the URA authorized staff to proceed with Phase 3 of the project and to work with the city to submit the map amendment request. So that's the stage where they would come forward, request the city actually to sponsor that amendment and move forward. Now, the board action that was taken, at that time, they asked, again, directed the executive director to approach the city to see if we would participate 50% in the cost of Phase 3, which would be about $2,000 at the same rate, 50% rate that we did for the Phase 2 work that has been previously authorized, and we can certainly do so if council directs it. We're asking, we certainly agree with it. This is a lot of work. It affects a lot of properties, both within and without Legacy Crossing. The amount of money, $2,000 to assist with this, is fairly minimal. We paid for the last $8,000 participation with $5,000 out of community development development participation funds, professional development funds, funds that we use to retain contractors or planners, and $3,000 was taken out of legislative non-prioritized projects. Sorry about that. Non-prioritized projects, of course, is the council's fund that is utilized for those projects that were not identified during the budget year or the budget preparation. Council approved $20,000 to be in that fund last year. $3,000 has been allocated for the first part of this assistance. If the council authorized another $2,000, there would be $15,000 remaining in non-prioritized projects through the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, 2018. Stand for any questions, as if I could answer them.
Questions for Gary?
I have one question regarding the study was taking place there, and it kind of takes in another project that we're working on now, is the underpass under Highway 8. Did that have any effect on the floodplain? The underpass project there have any effect on the floodplain?
I don't believe so. Bill could answer that. That's beyond my pay grade, but I think, if anything, it took into account the less restricted bridge that is on Highway 8 now. I don't believe that that the underpass project was anticipated to impact it, but because we're really talking downstream from that area.
Right. Well, the only reason I'm asking that is because I foresee that there will be an underpass at 95 as well.
Yes.
And
Right
it may
indeed.
have some effect on that, and I just want to make sure that that's taken into consideration.
Certainly.
That if that's going to, I doubt it would affect the flow enough to change it materially, but it certainly should be something we think about.
And
Because-
certainly, if the 100-year floodplain is remapped and there is an obstruction that would be constructed, say a little stub wall where people could do an underpass on under 95, then that would be permitted and it would be taken into account. It would really have no effect on this request tonight.
Thank you.
Gina?
I think this is another example of a really good partnership between the URA and the city, and I appreciate the work as an economic developer during the day. I really think that making it more developer-friendly in that area is very, very important. So, Your Honor, I propose that we receive the URA request to Moscow Urban Renewal Agency request to participate in funding Phase 3 of the flood study and authorize $2,000 from legislative non-prioritized projects.
Second.
Okay. Gina made a motion, Jim seconded to receive the Moscow Urban Renewal Agency request to participate in funding Phase 3 of the flood study and authorize $2,000 funding from legislative non-prioritized projects. Further discussion? I'll start the roll with Brandy.
I'll just add one
Okay.
slight little thing that Gary alluded to, but in addition to benefiting the developers, it also has the potential to benefit the current property owners who are paying flood insurance and may be able to approach their insurance companies and say, you know, maybe we don't need to carry this anymore. So, okay, that's all I
a good
wanted to
thing.
say, and I'm ready to vote aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Okay.